we must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarron.
And this is Jeremy Rothe Kushel.
All right, we're going to get into a discussion this time around about a follow-up, I guess, of sorts to a conversation we had here on the Antidote about around a month or so ago about the turn as far as like the recent events surrounding Ye, formerly known as Kanye West, and him going in a pretty full, he would call it DEFCON 3 tweet and all that direction of very overtly turning his criticisms and his the blame basically for his struggles as far as in the music industry and even elements of his personal life into focusing on this being something that's been orchestrated and perpetuated by Jewish people, by Jewish power, basically. And we're going to, and since then, there's been some developments in the whole Kanye West front. There's been Dave Chappelle on Saturday Night Live in an interview that the reaction to that, including an interview that Jon Stewart did with Stephen Colbert, that there was some interesting things to come out of Ben Shapiro, and as far as guidelines and I guess term I'd be looking for here would be parameters of what is and is not acceptable. And there's a debate around like what is and is not acceptable. How should things be handled? And we even have an escalation with Kanye West of Kanye and Nick Fuentes visiting Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago most recently. And we're going to talk about some of these developments here and put that into a bigger conversation that we've been having here on the Antidote for a number of years now, but is really ramping up and escalating in a current events lens right before our very eyes of this nature and element of the culture wars, the war on culture, as we call it, and was becoming a much more prominent and central, overtly Jewish proponent in terms of the conversation around issues of Jewish power and some of the legitimate discussions, and then some of the much more weaponized discussions that are becoming much more pronounced in terms of the overtness of it and in the dangers it could pose to people, and rhetorically and otherwise in terms of the escalating rhetoric that's going on right now. And I think the lack of responsible and productive reactions to it. So let's get into it.
Yeah, definitely. And I do want to note that as things have progressed, some of the core legitimate and important revelations, I would say, and criticisms that Ye has leveled are very obviously being muddied up and left by the wayside as the much more obviously weaponized core political content of his speech and contacts and actions now resulting in in the direct conversation with people like Milo, and now Nick Fuentes brought into it, and then the grandpapa himself at Mar-a-Lago, and all of that are taking up all of the attention, and also while further mudding the waters. I would point to one key thing that Ye exposed that should really get more attention, and there should be more depth of research and analysis around it, is when he directly exposed his quote unquote trainer, right? What's his name? Pasternak, I think is his name is. And he's obviously some kind of military intelligence, long term operative, mind control handler of some sort. And Ye really put out some direct messages and then directed people to look at him. And because he's worked, Pasternak has worked with a lot of different people. This is another touchstone to things like the nature of the weaponization of culture and the control of culture that it needs to be understood. It probably ties in very much with the much more macro mind control dynamics of deep state actions, including things like September 11th as a mass mind control tactic, but even into the background of the Epstein network, and even potentially who Epstein actually was. Okay, so there's that. Remember that even people like Britney Spears, who became sort of was part of an earlier phase of cultural uh, um, sort of focus around her being independent and breaking away from her dad, really also then missed the fact that her main security guard for many, many years, and especially during these times when she is in crisis and in legal conflict with the people handling her, was Israeli security background, right? So this is the crucial thing. And I'll just point out that in the middle of all of this, I still don't believe I've heard Ye. He's had massive, platforming and interviews, and continues to have lots of contact with media and paparazzi, and giving his take that goes viral on the internet. I still, and now people can direct me to this if I'm wrong, I still haven't heard him say the word Zionism, nor even mention the state of Israel. Now, it's possible he has, but I haven't seen it, and it's hours and hours. I paid attention to as much of it as I can. I listened to, virtually all of the main sort of the big platform interviews he's done, and it has not come up. Now you contrast the way that the Lex Friedman interview with Ye was done, especially in the immediate wake of Ye's public commentary, and the Death Con and all of that, where that went, and then Kylie Irving gets into the mix, and you contrast that with the way Lex Friedman then interviewed Ben Shapiro, where early on they actually take on the core political content of what is anti-Semitism in relationship to Israel. And that's at the core of the very beginning of that conversation. And it's highly limited. And I will make an assertion that there's a parallel thing happening at the mass media level, of where we're being fed into the structure of political, what is seen as politically legitimate conversation and analysis of the new anti-Semitism, and specifically with the Sharansky 21st century asserted 3Ds analysis, or I would say control mechanism, for whether a certain kind of speech around Israel specifically is quote unquote anti-Semitic. And the first D is delegitimization. And I think I pointed out before that I noticed that even the way that Jon Stewart handled this content in relationship to Stephen Colbert, the political content of this was fit in a very obscure way with this, where he basically said, I have been called anti Semitic for my criticism of the Israeli government's treatment of the Palestinians. Now, what you see is that this is the exact definition of where delegitimization in the Sharansky format is separated out from actual valid, legitimate, quote unquote, criticism of the state of Israel, right? And I believe that this is exactly what we're being fed into. And you see Shapiro on Lex Friedman going directly at this, where even Shapiro says, "I've had my criticism of the Israeli government." Now, he doesn't really say that his criticism of the Israeli government is not in how they treat the Palestinians, but it's how they maybe like treat his settler cousin or something like that. They are not
Yes.
harsh enough,
His
for yeah,
sister couldn't get a passport, right? Although that's America's fault, but still.
yeah. So this is the fundament, I think, of the actual core political operations that are going on in relationship to the shaping of the structure. Now, so that was one thing that Ye had brought up was Pasternak. Now that goes real deep, and that then touches on really how control is managed in terms of these very big media figures. And that has not really been emphasized enough. The other aspect was when he actually directly spoke to Ari Emanuel. And I thought that that was actually a very precise description of what Ye's real criticism of his the networks of control that surrounded him were. And so both of these things are being glossed over in favor of, okay, Ye and Trump, Ye and Fuentes, and I'll just say once again, when is the Yay conversation going to get into the actual geopolitics, right? And one thing that we pointed out was that what Yay was doing, even in his quote unquote criticism of the quote unquote Jews, was doing something very similar to what Ryan Dawson did throughout the entire Trump years. That ended up actually being a defense of the Trump operation, the 11/9 operation, where it's basically hanging, in Ryan Dawson's case, the Zionist ball and chain around Trump's neck, and that's Kushner. That's where you locate the danger. There is in Kushner, and Ye did something very, very similar. Like I think Ryan Dawson should actually start accusing Ye of stealing his work, as Ryan Dawson accuses everybody else of.
Um, that's interesting, and it's I think with this, it's very interesting that I've identified that this is the I think you have the coming together of the, and this is what like the ties that bind it. I think the alt right and the alt light, quote unquote, together was that they had the same quote unquote enemies in terms of the basically blaming the same interests for the problems in both in their countries and globally. And I think with Ye, like this is he is and it makes a lot of sense that you would have Candace Owens being like the person to who is employed by Ben Shapiro at the Daily Wire. And I guess I haven't been following too much recently, but there's been a bit of trouble in paradise with I think with Candace Owens and some of the things she's tweeted out recently, but I haven't paid super close attention to that. But it makes sense that it was someone directly affiliated with the Ben Shapiro network who brought Ye, then known as Kanye, into understanding and seeing the light about how the he is more overtly willing to say Jewish, but the how Black America is controlled, and it's controlled by these the way it was done was, even though Ye will say like it's Jews that are controlling me, that are ruining my life, and that have this control over our people by encouraging degeneracy and abortion and all this, but it makes sense that it was done in the context of all making it into this weaponized, I think, culture war type of narrative by, oh, it's the control. See, well, there was no reason to actually be mad about George Floyd, and that was just that was that was the, I guess, maybe more unnamed elites in Candace Owens's world that were manipulating the
Or the
response to
George
it. And
Soroses in Ye's world, yeah.
yeah, well, of course, Candace Owens will probably say Soros, but it won't link Soros to if anything. Their narrative is that like Soros is, Soros is the actual. I don't know. They tippy toe around Soros being an actual like anti-Semite who sold out his family to the Nazis or whatnot. But it's in this very culture war. It's alt right and alt light friendly culture war narrative of the ultimately it's the left that's destroying our society, and in Kanye's world, I guess it's the leftist Jewish power structure that's destroying Black America and that's destroying our society in general. And so he was brought into this, and it makes sense that it would be Candace Owens, I guess, that directly gets the credit for. waking up, to seeing these realities, and that it fits right into this whole narrative. But Ye is perfect, I think, in some ways and of course, he probably says Jew a little bit too much for comfort for some people, obviously, in the alt light. But I mean, he's a great encapsulation of like this alt right and alt light in terms of having the same enemies. And it's great when Ye talks about the forces behind the social degradation of our society, but just don't say the J word too overtly. And even and then I guess he's got this alliance, I guess, with I'm not sure exactly his relationship with Nick Fuentes, but Fuentes is like also this perfect culture war figure who says these. I mean, and he like you go listen to the things Fuentes says, like he outright advocates for a dictatorship to stop the Jewish cultural destruction of our society, and all this. I mean, the rhetoric is extremely escalatory, obviously, with Nick Fuentes, but still into this narrative of where Fuentes sees Israel as a problem. Kanye won't directly say it, but even then, it's like the problem is that they use they use their power over us too. And there's no differentiation, of course, between liberal leftist Jews and hardcore Zionists. There's no differentiation in these worlds, but they use their power over us to do things that we can't do, and we support them with our tax dollars, and we just need to. But it's all in this very culture war friendly narrative. And there's outside of like some of the important, as you said, like there are important things that are being exposed in there with Ye, and even with some of these very bad figures, like you'll find some elements of truth that are obviously heavily weaponized in a toxic direction that you can't take them seriously as sources because of just how toxic things are around them. But ultimately, you're just seeing a very controlled, I think, still even in the case of Kanye, it seems to be still under a somewhat tight control, whether it's knowing or not, to him. And there might be a fear that like maybe if this guy is genuinely like unhinged or whatnot, that he may start saying things he's not supposed to say. But so far, like it's been in this with both there might even be a horseshoe around Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes in terms of like maybe the elements of like the control of the discourse and of the narrative, and in the way former Kanye West goes about things.
And in the mix here is, of course, the personal aspects, the personal interest aspects, as we've pointed out, that one of the obviously problematic aspects of the way that Ye approached this whole topic was that he smeared his role, as he even talked about it, as he said, "Well, I'm not up to the level of prophet. Someone else needs to do that, but I am a potential, that's where I would like to head." And I would sort of insert myself as a potential thought leader, once as he pointed out, wait till I get my money right. Now that I've got my money right, now I can say things as a leader of my community. But that it was all wrapped up in his own personal resentments, and many of them legitimate, but also many of them basically he made choices about who he was going to hook up with, what family he was going to marry into, and all of that. So I think that continues to even be more exaggerated, as even Ye has made recent comments to a media that would suggest that, as some people suspected, that there was a personal incentive that Ye was using this speech to actually try to break contracts, get out of certain relationships with companies such as Adidas, and that seems to have worked out in terms of that. Now he's also at the same time lost a large amount of equity and value and monetary value in relationship to that, but he's also now more independent to pursue what he wants to do. And you'll see that he's just continuing on deeply with his interest in clothing and manufacturing, and all of that. So there's that, and then when you throw in Kyrie Irving into the mix, I think then what you really get, and there's some intersection here with Ye, but the downside to this, now I don't, I've expressed that I do, I get the sense that the larger public conversation around these two prominent black men in the United States in arts and culture and media and then in sports and both of these areas where the management power is, I would say, I think it'd be fair to say dominated in certain ways by Jewish power networks. That this is a an example, there's a public example being made in relationship to them in a way that harkens back to slave structures and slave years of a buck breaking and all of that. So that's I think that's there at the same time as this weaponization of both the strands of public speech and analysis that Ye and Irving are introducing. Now, when you get Irving, you get the whole big thing is about the film from Hebrews to Negroes, and that then takes this all into the realm of a conflict over identity that then gets back into thousands of years of history and that question and questions of the slave trade and I'll also notice that it avoids the actual core political content and geopolitical analysis of our current moment. It gets everybody fighting about what happened hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and not that that's not historically important, but when it's done in combination with a very specific avoidance of actual current politics and the real domestic content, cultural conflict content, I would say, of the United States and that much more recent history, which then you have the ADL coming into the conversation to reference that as the follow up to the B'nai B'rith. When you combine that with then the background of like Irving and you then get a whole sense of like, oh, the flat earth, and you get the whole like conspiracy meme culture then thrown into the mix in a similar kind of way as we notice around maybe the white right during Trump, where you had the alt right and the alt right and their conflict over the quote unquote Jewish question. But then parallel to all of that, you have running the this conspiracy discourse that really muddies the water. And I pointed out before, but the rise of flat Earth discourse time wise seem to be crucial in relationship to some of the dirtying up of the public mind in anticipation, I would say, of the 11/9 operation. It came online like in the core of the Obama years and then escalated up to the point of the 11/9 operation. So I do note that too. And so what I think we need to do in the midst of all of this is actually take on the core political questions and figure out the language and use the language that will actually help us to discuss this and then also hone in on the historical arcs that will help explain this moment and then potentially remediate the problem. And so in that case what we really need to focus on is the question of Jewish power dynamics, Jewish power networks. Those are the things that are very important and legitimate uh, avenues for discourse in an American context, let's say, in terms of this conversation. And then additionally, then the question of the Jewish state and Jewish state power networks and the history of all of that, and then how that then intersects, I would say, from an American perspective in our current moment. So I'd like for us to begin to ground this structurally in seeing how all of this begins to feed into a way of both further muddying the discourse, politically weaponizing these figures, and then additionally feeding us all into the maw of this Natan Sharansky version of the new anti-Semitism with the three Ds.
And we'll get into the 3Ds here in a minute if you want to, Jeremy. But I'll follow up with what you said with the whole Kyrie Irving thing with the slave trade and who is responsible. It's similar, I think, to the the Holocaust revisionism, and I think in that it's they're both, I think, ultimately, and especially in terms of like the the context of things and like the state of things and the narratives and the rhetoric going on, is that I think they both do turn into, at least in the way they're currently framed, do turn into dead ends by and large. I think a big reason for that is because you'll find with both, quote unquote, Holocaust revisionism and the going back to the slave trade and who was responsible for it, that especially in some of these weaponized discourses, that it's not so much even about trying to really get to the bottom of real history as it is ultimately the goals and motivations are to pin it collectively ultimately on Jewish power, and ultimately pin it collectively on, the Jews as a collective group. Like the Jews were behind our being taken from Africa and brought over to the New World as slaves and all this. And the Jews they conspired to make up their own, exaggerate their own suffering and all this. So it turns into, it's such a toxic dead end. And I mean, and even the sources where Kyrie Irving is getting this from, it goes from Jews are to blame for our misfortunes being brought over here to the New World to they're really pretending to be what we really are, which are like the chosen kings and all this. I mean, it's such a toxic mess of like a sewer but it wouldn't have to be this way. And honestly, but we're so far gone in terms of like the mainstream rhetoric as far as where they're at in terms of a constructive response. And then we'll find that like a lot of times it's the establishment elitist institutional narrative control responses that play right into it, like that they're in a lot of cases are equally as problematic as, or almost as problematic as this, because there's no constructive or productive, I don't think, at any high level type of attempts to like try to really bring any type of real light to all of this. It's just the conversation goes the blaming of them, and then the response is to like just shut it down as it's anti-Semitic and nothing's. And so it becomes where I don't think there's any real serious quest for like any type of real serious historical or current truth about trying to get to a more accurate assessment of the state of our politics, societal, domestically, geopolitically, globally, both long term, historically, and current term within the discourse all around. And and it and it's typical that this becomes like the parameters are, yay, it's a liberal, social, Marxist, Jewish conspiracy to undermine us. And then with Kyrie Irving, it's the long term. It's the long-term undermining of our people that goes back to usurping us as like the true kings and chosen people.
Yeah. And one thing is that the macro structure here, and this is, I'm talking about like the last 100 years, let's say, where Zionism is on the rise, that this is what keeps coming back as, to me, it begins to look like a Zionist pincher operation where after a while, it's hard to sort of take this as just like people, making rhetorical slips or mistakes in talking about the Jews. And it was interesting that Dave Chappelle started which what I thought was actually a comedically, it was a quite effective response to all of this at Saturday Night Live. I think it was comedically um, uh, very effective. And the way that he started about it though was saying that the two words that you never put together and then your career goes well, he said, was the and Jews. Now, there was obviously, he left out some stuff there, I think, in terms of, the actual, some actually more helpful beyond the comedic platform, but some actual really helpful public interest rhetoric would have been to be able to actually sort of distinguish this thread here where people keep coming back to talking about the Jews, whether it's yay, he's going to go Death Con 3 on the Jews, right? Or just as you pointed out, Greg, like this, what seems to be a, 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 a returning rhetorical uh, move of sort of lumping together all of the people by talking about the Jews rather than just adding an additional word. You can talk if you just talk about Jewish power, you can really begin to then distinguish. And Chappelle set himself up to actually make these kinds of points that other people have made before. And be like when you talk about an organized power structure, let's say, when you're talking about what he said, if we see a group of blacks engaging in potential crime, we call it a gang. If we see Italians engaging in potential crime, we call it the mafia or the mob. And then if we see Jews potentially engaging in crime, we don't talk. You keep your mouth shut. Right, is the way that he put it. Now, just an additional few lines there. I'm sure he could have figured it out comedically to talk about. He could have brought in the Catholic Church, which is usually the most common example of when people say, okay, there is power structure issues inside of the Catholic Church. One, the most obvious being the uh, the defending and the ultimate sort of platforming of pedophile priests and the protecting of them and the moving of them around. Now, that's an obvious point that going after that power structure and the criminal aspects of that Catholic power structure does not mean that you're going after the Catholics or Catholic people in general or the Catholic world, right? And all those things. And so that point could have been made, I think, and that was a real key lost opportunity of Chappelle in his comedic commentary. So that's one aspect of this is that you once you start seeing that kind of discourse, the Jews or what can easily be then mapped onto the idea of the historical trope of the Jew or the Jews, you're very likely in this day and age, let's say, you're very likely involved in Zionist power pincher moves, I would say. And this has been very obvious, like even Herzl was spoke about it. He said the anti-Semites will be our most loyal friends. The anti-Semitic countries will be our allies. Right? This is the godfather, really, of modern political Zionism, and that was not just an idea that was practiced. And so anytime that you see the rhetoric I'd say devolving into the Jews and the easily identified sort of the Jewish trope uh, area, I would say you're seeing actually Zionist power
Um,
at work.
Jeremy, I'll throw in that I'll give an example here in that what you're saying here is absolutely correct. Like that you could differentiate that, like it doesn't mean because you're going after pedophiles at a high level, at high levels of a church denomination that has hundreds of millions of members globally. It doesn't mean that you're going after all people who subscribe to the Catholic Church. But I will say that as far as these pincher movements go, that I see a similar dynamic at play in terms of like this idea that if you criticize Jewish power, you want to hurt all the Jews or whatever, and you want to. And there's elements, of course, the weaponized elements. Like I mean, obviously, that at very least rhetorically plays into that with the rhetoric. And I mean, some of it, and the real danger surrounding a lot of the rhetoric that's out there. But also, it is a way to deflect from like any serious criticism of like Jewish or maybe more directly Zionist power, the power of the state of Israel, and that's done. But then also you'll see like these same pincher movements were very effective at making people believe, and I think there's a cultural and ethnic elements as even when it comes to non-Jews. Like there are people who believe that like criticism of the Catholic Church is an attempt to like try to destroy all Catholicism, or criticism of elements of Christianity is to destroy or the weaponized Christian Christian right, evangelical Christian right, and all this with the weaponized culture wars and all this is like, oh, you're going to destroy all. You want to destroy all Christians and take away people's right to believe in what they want to believe, or even with the whole Trump thing in January 6th, like holding high level majority, maybe say Caucasian conservative or Caucasian leaders of like the whole element around January 6th. Oh, that's just a plot to destroy and to collectively hurt 175 to 100 million God-fearing Donald Trump supporters. So you see these going on within a lot of context here, and I think that there's a lack of context around around that, where something could very easily be turned into, don't talk about this because then you just want to persecute everyone who believes in it. So I see that at play here, and I think you're absolutely correct about like the way that Chappelle could have gone about that. Like you see the Catholics, yeah, it's a conspiracy, but not all Italians are gun-toting mobsters, and not all Italians are stereotypical Goodfellas. Not all Catholics are pedophiles, and not all Jews are in a conspiracy or use their power to control celebrities or whatnot.
And just a little bit of basic common sense analysis and some familiarity of like the immediately relevant history in our country could of and could still help out in the middle of explaining what's all going on here, right? Like even in terms of like Chappelle and Jon Stewart commenting on Ye in relationship to his actual experience in what you might call Hollywood. That there's an analysis there that should happen just in terms of the cultural and political and monetary power aspects of Jewish power networks. How does that all work? Now, Jon Stewart gave this during his spot with Stephen Colbert. Seemed to give a very he ended up in a place where he seem to delegitimize any question of talking about Jewish power in Hollywood, for example. But then at the end, he then pointed in a similar kind of way that I think that he pointed to the we should accept the Natan Sharansky version of new anti-Semitism in relationship to our quote unquote legitimate criticism of Israel in a similar way to the way that he ended up then opening up the conversation while also keeping it constricted around how then might we talk about a place that Chappelle said he's like, if you I've been to Hollywood, he's like, there are a lot of Jews, he said, in Hollywood, right? This was during his Saturday Night Live comedy bit. Now he then said that doesn't mean that they run things. There's a lot of blacks in Ferguson. They don't they don't run things, right? But he that was Chappelle's way of opening it up. Maybe we should talk about what is the relationship of Jewish power to Hollywood, for example, right? Now Stewart then went the way he phrased it was, well, just because a group of people are interested or congregate around a certain area doesn't mean that they're involved in a conspiracy. Right. All right. So these are both true to some extent, right? And so Stewart obviously left the tried to open up some quote unquote legitimate uh, angle to discuss the question of Jewish power in an American context around this by saying, well, just because there's a lot of Jews doesn't mean it's a conspiracy. All right. So then that then opens up. Then how then do we talk about Jewish power? How do we talk about Jewish privilege? How do we open up conversations about, okay, how does the Jewish power angle work in relationship to Hollywood, or as we've also seen in terms of other positions of power, or even in America's higher, educational institutions. There appears to be some kind of Jewish nepotism going on. Now, that doesn't equate to a quote unquote organized Jewish conspiracy, right? Now, then, if you then bring in the history component, see that's not so hard to do. Just to sort of use accurate terminology to begin to assess a current reality where there's facts and statistics that can be pointed to begin to have a conversation about a current power landscape, let's say, and what looks to be an unjust power landscape, especially in terms of the kinds of criticisms that Ye was actually bringing up, or that was fully on display with the response to Kyrie Irving in many ways. But then you bring in some history, right? Then you'd be like, all right, what is the actual background of Hollywood? Is there actually organized criminality in the background of Hollywood? And you'd have to say yes, right? So I would say then people then should go, for example, go watch or rewatch John Swin's incredible documentary, The Unauthorized History of the American Century, which really gets into this whole landscape in many ways, including Hollywood, and shows this intersection there between aspects of Jewish power and the growing quote unquote national security state in the United States. And then you combine that with the actual background of the big players in Hollywood. For example, you go to the book Super Mob by Gus Russo, which tends to center around exposing people like Lou Wasserman, crucial key player in, like, the musical component of Hollywood, MCA, and how there is a lot of intersection with organized crime, the Jewish mob, right? This is sort of similar to what surrounds the facilitation of the Epstein Maxwell network, or what was called in the newspaper the mega group, but are actually a group of influential Jewish Zionist billionaires who have many of them have backgrounds, either their parents or even them themselves, involved in organized crime. Everyone from the Bronfman family and the bootlegging background, or someone like Michael Steinhardt, who became the dean really of the Birthright Israel program, with the family background of his father being deeply involved with Meyer Lansky and the Jewish mob syndicate at that point. And so then you actually can bring in facts that actually help describe these sort of two components here. How do we analyze actual Jewish power and Jewish nepotism? Then how do we actually then analyze the question of criminality and conspiracy and organized crime? And then sometimes, where do those intersect? Hollywood is a good example of where those two actually intersect. Now, because there's Jewish nepotism, I would assert in Hollywood, does it nepotism is not necessarily criminal. It doesn't signal conspiratorial intent, and yet it functions very likely in an unjust way in terms of the socio-political, economic, cultural relations in the commanding heights of the America's cultural institutions and media institutions, right? But then this is where you then begin to bring in the actual core geopolitical history of the rise of Zionism and of the Jewish state, because once you're dealing with Meyer Lansky, then you're also then dealing with the core of the underside of deep state politics, right? Deep state politics, the intersection of the national security, especially covert or clandestine operations, intelligence aspects at the commanding heights, and then how that intersects then with the underworld of organized crime and the black economy. And someone like Lansky is at the intersection there of the organized criminal backing and material, even material support, like actual weaponry support in terms of the fledgling and at one point proto Israeli state, where you're even before the commanding heights of the Israeli national security state getting formed and coming into power. So I think if you then can deal with all those three different areas, I would say you have the question of discussing Jewish power, terms like Jewish nepotism, or I would then insert Jewish privilege, which is it should be further figured out because it operates in a different way, I think, than what has usually been talked about, and especially in the last years about white privilege. It operates in some ways in terms of like white Jews in a similar way, but then differently because then you do still have this question of, of the quote unquote mass of Jews feeling like the target of some of this rising public conversation and the heat of it, and the in many some ways properly perceived danger of it to the average Jew. So you have both the individual Jewish victimization operating at the same time as different aspects of Jewish privilege that sometimes then intersect with white privilege, but are not just that. Once you introduce then Jewish nepotism into the fold, then you then see there's aspects of Jewish privilege that operate in relationship to the Jewish power networks. Okay, so that's what you can be. We can begin to use terms and accurate facts to begin to open up that conversation. And then you can deal with the question of actual what Chappelle was hinting at, right? Okay, we know, there's black gangs, there's Italian mafia, and there's also Jewish organized crime or the Jewish mob, right? And that then intersects sometimes in terms of these big cultural institutions, if you're talking about Hollywood, obviously, or directly in relationship then to this third aspect, the rise of the Jewish state and Jewish state power politics, which then show themselves to be actually the political payload of all of these sort of, I would say, weaponized false dialectics and these actual Zionist pincher moves that are on display right now, where it's Ye in Mar-a-Lago with the quote unquote greatest U.S. president that Israel has ever had, right? That becomes the actual core political payload of the moment. So then I think we then have to then deal with the actual the framework, the structural framework of the intellectual control mechanisms that have risen alongside the rise of the of Jewish state power. Now, Sharansky as this crucial figure here, and now we've continued to highlight him because there's a lot of questions even about his background, right? But even what's overt needs to be deeply criticized and questioned and called into question of legitimacy. Sharansky's whole artifice, I think, his intellectual artifice, his political artifice, and his personal artifice is deeply problematic at best and highly illegitimate, I would say, ultimately. So then it makes sense then to understand what we're being fitted into, whether it's Ben Shapiro on Lex Friedman, the contrasting that of Ye on Lex Friedman, the conversation there, then put that next to Dave Chappelle on Saturday Night Live and Jon Stewart with Stephen Colbert in a much more subtle and sort of cloaked way of putting us right into the maws of Natan Sharansky's new anti-Semitism and the 3Ds. And just final point I'll make on this is that, that it's obvious now that these networks are at the commanding heights of the actual places of power that legalize the nature of these rhetorical assertions, such as someone like Deborah Lipstadt, the anti-Semitism czar at the level of a diplomat post in terms of the State Department in the United States. She's not only a Sharansky, uh, she's a sort of next generation or, a Sharansky student of some sort. They are peers in certain ways, but she's, in terms of the new anti-Semitism, she's a Sharansky um, student, I would say. And she's also a long term asset of the Wexner Epstein connection. Wexner has been her main patron over many, 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 many years. Now we're talking about the heart of all of this, right? We're talking about the heart of actual organized crime. We're talking about the heart of Jewish power in relationship to economics and media networks, right? You're talking about Les Wexner in relationship to the dawn of the mall culture, of the sexualization in advertising, in terms of the limited brands and Victoria's Secret and all of that. And then you're also additionally talking about actual deep state power networks in terms of this relationship with Israel and how there's a conjoinment there in terms of the deep state operations in the United States and Israel and the whole background of Air America and Wexner and the moving of its location, and then how Epstein compromat operates at a high level.
Yep. Very true, very true. And once again, we always say this, Jeremy, but I think a lack of long-term accountability when it comes to responsible, the responsible media, the responsible institutions that are supposed to be. And once again, this is another issue that we're going to have a problem with because there hasn't been any serious attempts to get to any serious truth telling, like in terms of the institutions or the hard truths, still largely remain concealed, both short term and long term. And I can't stress enough that the shying away from and the inability to deal with hard truths, whether it would come to obviously like the events of our generation, which have very much been shaped by something such as September 11th, or even going back to longer term history. I mean, over the course of many years, it continues to be an impediment. And once again, I would say the biggest roadblock against these, or maybe the biggest antidote, so to speak, to some of these problems are we're facing would be like a real hard, just trying to get to the bottom of the truth of the way things are and the way things have been that we have not gotten. And I keep going back to that is the lack of the lack of serious hard truth telling is continues to be such a major impediment to progress and allows the continuing, I think, perpetuation of and escalating of these narratives that are going to become more and more of a problem for us going forward.
And what one thing I wanted to note around the Jon Stewart dynamics here, because I think that he's a key beacon for understanding the liberal Jewish voice in all of this. And he's also on the rise as a political commentator. For example, he just very recently had about an hour long interview show with both Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice in relationship to their backgrounds as secretaries of state in the United States, and then all about American geopolitics and power politics abroad and in American influence abroad, and then always coming down ultimately to questions of war and peace. Now that's a whole, there's a whole analysis to do around what was said and what wasn't said there. But I'll just note that at the very, in the very similar kind of time scheme here of his conversation with Stephen Colbert, he not only, I think, in a very subtle way, uh, led us into opening while controlling the discourse in these two critical areas. One being about Jewish power uh, in the United States in relationship to high level cultural, political, economic institutions, but then also in terms of the question of Israel and the Palestinians and Palestine. He opened those up while both closing it down, the entry point, and controlling the conversation if it were to happen moving forward. And it was very strange the way that the whole thing ended up, where Stewart actually said something like, he was quote unquote joking, but it was very awkward. He basically said that he knows Stephen Colbert actually hates the Jews or hates us Jews, right? Something like that, Greg. And then
Yeah.
they joke about that for a little bit. And
Right.
Stephen Colbert does the exact same thing that Dave Chappelle opens his SNL monologue with, of reading this. It looks sort of like an ADL, maybe written description or some kind of description that people have been saying about that my sympathy is with the Jewish people, and I don't, and against the anti-Semites, and all of that, and Colbert then recites that too, and then Stewart then begins to like put his hand all over Colbert's face. Now, to me, there was an issue of awkwardness in the middle of that because the joke fell flat. Colbert seemed to be sort of a little bit insulted by it, even, or it was very made uncomfortable by it. But then Stewart, I would say, both handles the awkwardness of the moment while then also physicalizing some kind of power dynamics. I would say. Now, many people know that Colbert makes his way out of the Jon Stewart empire in many ways to then being on his own as a late night show host. And so Stewart somehow feels entitled, feels privileged, let's say, to put his hand all over the host's face, his ostensible friend's face, especially in an era of like, of like COVID and people's sensitivities around all this kind of thing. It to me that was an assertion of physical power. And almost like a cultural, an example of a cultural domination kind of scenario that I saw happen of Jon Stewart, the guest, palming the face, touching all these different parts of Stephen Colbert's head in the middle of this, while after saying, "I know you actually secretly, hate us Jews who you work with," or something to that effect.
That's very interesting because I'm thinking about now what I identified with the early portion of that interview, and where it was where it was Stephen Colbert was through in his own quote unquote comedic ways, like mocking the idea that Jews have any power whatsoever. Like, oh, Jewish accomplishments in sports began and ended with Sandy Koufax, and he's our Jewish sports hero, and there's nothing else noteworthy that's happened for Jews in sports, and oh, I can't. I never thought it would be from a person with the name Irving that would come out and say the Jews are a problem. And oh, I only wish we could have a Christian president just once so that people will stop thinking we control the world. And so, you combining what you saw here as this power play here with the way that was framed, like I mean, in addition to it being, it's a godsend for like the kind of people that do want to assert that there is a monolithic collective Jewish conspiracy to control the world, because they will see things like that. I'm sure like certain audiences will see things like that as, oh, it's proof. And on one hand, like there's this massive downplaying of like any questioning of like any type of like motivation driven cultural or ethnic influence at a high level, and then this what you might be describing very awkward dynamic at the end of the interview. And I think there's something that could be there could probably be a pretty good illustration put together of those contrasts with the beginning and the end of the interview that I noticed with like this. And maybe I'm just talking a little bit here, but I compare that with like the beginning portion of the interview where it's just like, oh, this is absurd, Sandy Koufax, and why don't we just have a Christian president so people will stop blaming us for things? And then what you're describing here at the end, it's all very very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that even the beginning of it was a trope of a trope, right? Where they're both using they're sort of making fun of what are seen as the tropes of the Jewish conspiracy, of where there is a single room where all of the decisions are made, and Stewart identifies himself as the spokesperson for the Jews, or in this case, or something like that, or then going into the kind of area that is very, enjoyable to the Uns, the new Uns review types, and the Steven Sailors, and the alt right sort of ethnic or racially obsessed types about Jews and sports, and I mean, and Sandy Koufax was the end all and be all of any sort of successful Jews in sports, right? And it's first of all not true, right? But they're allowed to, I guess, joke about it. I mean, just go look at Jews in sports. There are Jews in sports too. Like even David Beckham is, part Jewish, I think. Um, and so they're playing with this while then trying to shut down actual questions of, yeah, there are rooms of Jewish power where decisions are made. The questions about the
Yes.
Iraq War, I imagine, included rooms of Jewish power.
The ones who you could identify within a very short radius, as Thomas Friedman put it. But in some ways, this is the opposite of like the stereotype about Black Americans in sports, and that like, oh, they're just the talented athletes. They're breeded to be talented athletes, and where Colbert's basically like the flip side of that, like, oh, we're not bred to be like Sandy Koufax. We're bred to be the power. We're bred to be more like guys in boardrooms making decisions, but don't actually say we're in the boardrooms making decisions.
Yeah, right. And again, the intersection then with the actual question of the difference between sort of legal nepotism and sort of in tribe selection and all of that versus actual organized power criminal networks, such as the question surrounding what was called the mega group that directly surround such operations such as Epstein Maxwell, high level compromise questions of the selling and the agit propaganda for the American war in Iraq, which then sort of gets glossed over and sort of hidden, very intensely hidden by Stewart's conversation with Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice, where he says, "I don't want to relitigate it." Bro, you never litigated it in the first place. You've nowhere in public said anything serious about how the Iraq War actually was whipped up and which actual power networks were core and central to it, without which it wouldn't have happened as such. Doesn't mean it's the only power pole involved. But again, I'll point out, and this again is the sort of the question of separating the quote unquote the Jews from Jewish power or Zionist power politics, that to a one, the entirety of Jewish power institutions, all of them could then be identified as part of the larger Israel lobby that surrounds an organization such as APAC, were to a one in support of the Iraq War. Meanwhile, the Jews, the actual Jews in America, were, as far as I know, statistically the most prevalent of any identifiable group in the United States in terms of, I think, both religion and ethnicity, potentially, of being against the war in Iraq. And so there you have it. And what you can actually then point out is there are actual people with names and power networks that can be identified in relationship to what was an organized crime, which was the Iraq War. It was an international crime. It was a domestic crime. And it apparently involved even background crime as leverage and compromise if you take seriously what Epstein and Maxwell were actually doing beyond just being sort of dark money managers or finders or movers and shakers or just quote unquote just sex traffickers. What lay on top of that? Compromat. And then you have Wexner in the mix and all that surrounds him. And you have the him bringing in Frank Luntz to do the study, the Israel study for the Iraq War and how to market it. And you have a lot to talk about in a very factual way, which I would say basically all of this, even the better, sort of less weaponized takes, I think, like Chappelle being one of the less weaponized takes, the more, at least artistically effective takes in the middle of this. Virtually no one, I'd say basically no one, is actually dealing with the real conversation here. And Jon Stewart is probably at this point one of the strongest voices for the ongoing cover up of actual I would say, Jewish state criminality, and is leading us into a way of basically, well, you can have criticisms of the Israeli state's treatment of the Palestinians, but if you call into question the legitimacy of an ethno-religious state formed in the middle of the 20th century on the back and on the ethnic cleanse in some cases, and ongoing politically genocided and military occupied backs of the indigenous people, the Palestinians there, then you're sort of dealing with like actual high level criminal politics, and this is the area where Jon Stewart wants to control the discourse. And then I would say people like Dave Chappelle are not going to be any help in terms of actually any content, any core political content. Now, Dave Chappelle may be sort of opened up the potentials of how you could continue to talk about some of these areas in a way that you could get away with, let's say. But in terms of the actual core political content, that remains to we the people to actually take on.
Yep. And I think on that note, Jeremy, we're about to wrap up for this recording.
Okay, yes, and maybe what we can do is include the links to a few different Wikipedia entries. One is the 3Ds of anti-Semitism. The 3Ds, or 3D test of anti-Semitism, is a set of criteria which was formulated by Israeli politician Natan Sharansky in order to distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The 3Ds stand for delegitimization, demonization, and double standards, each of which, according to the test, indicates anti Semitism. The test is intended to draw the line between legitimate criticism of the State of Israel, its actions and policies, and non legitimate criticism, which becomes anti Semitic. The 3Ds test is intended to rebut arguments which say that, quote, any criticism toward the state of Israel is considered anti Semitic and therefore legitimate criticism is silenced and ignored, unquote. This test was adopted by the U.S. Department of State in 2010 and replaced by the working definition of anti Semitism in 2017. The test, however, has been criticized for vagueness and its use to define criticism of Israel as anti Semitic. So we'll include that. We'll also include the Wikipedia link to the new anti Semitism, of which the 3D test is a subset, and maybe folks can begin to work into the background some of this. And I would just finally say that in this area, again, words can be both weapons or tools of that destroy, I think, or block real constructive political public discourse, or they can be used to help identify and factually, legitimately, I would say, and also constructively using the proper word. So, and there are Jewish academics that are really beginning to push on this point that the whole word anti-Semitism is not helpful at this point. And Deborah Lipstadt is probably one of the key defenders of continuing the use of the word anti-Semitism. It's used as a singular word without a hyphen between anti and Semitism, and it's all in a sort of uh, an echo chamber around a 18th century German anti-Semitism as such. Now there are a growing set of voices, some of them Jewish in terms of intellectuals and academics, who say that if you really want to talk about a sort of generalized uh, phenomenon, you should be talking about anti-Jewishness, which would include, anti-Judaism, anti-Jews, and then anti-Jewishness, and basically totally replace what I would call the Zionist-occupied word anti-Semitism, which has actually contextually and in terms of the word history there, it does go back much, much longer than modern German anti-Semites. And it goes back to questions of Shem and Noah's son, So there's a biblical origin. It's also related to Semitic languages, and Shem potentially relating to the desert. So I think that it is too occupied and too weaponized a term to deal with, except for responding to people who are saying talking about anti-Semitism per se. So I think anti-Jewishness is a more helpful term that actually can describe a certain kind of weaponized take against Jewishness more broadly. And then we can then use terms such as Jewish power, Jewish nepotism, Jewish privilege, Jewish state power, Jewish deep state. I've talked about the difference between the Jewish deep state and the deep Jewish state. One is an actual what you'd say the underside of deep politics, of deep state, right? The global organized crime and covert and clandestine political warfare operations networks. One of which you could talk about in terms of the relationship of Sionim, matrilineal Jews around the world who are dedicated to the state of Israel, who can then be used as assets by actual Israeli intelligence officers, and then obviously the Jewish deep state being the state of Israel's covert operations mechanisms that will do things such as relationships between Epstein and Ehud Barak, high level compromise, technology transfer, nuclear secrets stolen, materials stolen, but also apparently the agitation for mass crimes such as the Iraq War. So I think if we figure out our language and figure out how to speak accurately, and then combine that with intensely core political history to this moment, then we can constructively move the conversation forward.
I agree with you, and I'll close on my end by saying, and this is something that could be the topic of a whole nother show in the future, but there are similarities between the actual organized Jewish power interests and organized white quote unquote power interests, and that there is this effort to, I think, to conceal elements of both, and I think you see that through the response to more critical based teachings of history domestically here in the United States, of more critical teachings of American history, and through which were seen as an attack both on this idea of America as this exceptional, special nation, and also and also even the elements of some of the things that the exceptional American state is backed, such as the state of Israel. I think is seen as a threat by both of these organized classes of power. This idea of a more critical teaching of history, and so I think you see like a coming together between some of these very, very heavily Zionist elements. Look at like libs of TikTok and all the controversy around that. And that's just very, very hardcore Zionism coming together with these white grievance types who are able to use any criticism or any critical evaluations of the history of the United States and the history and actual serious, like potential quote unquote realistic white privilege in ways where being of European descent has been beneficial in America. And you see a coming together there. And so that's a whole other conversation for another potential long form topic, but there's a coming together in terms of the pushback against actual serious, as problematic as they are in their own way, of more critical based teachings of an analysis of our own domestic history, and then some of the things that are supported within like this very weaponized conservative based ideal of what America is, and even the question of like America and Israel and all of that. So I find that at play, and you'll see that. And the Jon Stewarts, knowingly or unknowingly, just play right into that with with the way they portray things. But I wanted to put that together of like this common pushback against the critical based analysis of both short term and long term history.
All right, that's very helpful. All right, until next time, thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody out there. We appreciate you. Antidote, we are out.